March 8, 1970. Lions Drag Strip in Long Beach, California. The sun hangs low over the quarter-mile, casting long shadows across the asphalt that has witnessed countless battles between the fastest machines on Earth. The smell of nitromethane saturates the air, that acrid, suffocating perfume that drag racers call the smell of power. In the staging lanes, a black dragster idles with mechanical menace. Swamp Rat XIII, they call it. The wind charger. Behind the wheel sits a man who has already conquered this sport more times than most could dream. His name is Don Garlits. They call him Big Daddy. What happens in the next few seconds will change drag racing forever. The early history of drag racing reads like a fever dream of post-war American audacity. Born on the dry lake beds of California's Mojave Desert in the years after World War II, drag racing began with young men who'd learned to wrench on aircraft engines and now applied that knowledge to hot rods cobbled together from scrap and swagger. By the early 1950s, the National Hot Rod Association had formed to give structure to what had become an underground obsession. Wally Parks founded NHRA in 1951 with a mission: get the kids off the streets and onto sanctioned strips. What he created was something far more profound. He created a culture. By the mid-1960s, drag racing had evolved into a spectacular theater of speed. At the top of the food chain sat the top-fuel dragsters, nitromethane-burning monsters that could cover a quarter-mile in under 7 seconds at speeds exceeding 220 miles per hour. But these machines were designed with a configuration that would seem, in retrospect, absolutely insane. They were called slingshots. The slingshot dragster placed the driver behind the engine with his legs straddling the transmission and driveline. The massive, supercharged engine sat directly in front of the driver's face, the clutch assembly between his legs, the fuel tank nearby. Imagine sitting in a metal skeleton with 8,000 horsepower worth of explosives wrapped around you, then accelerating faster than a falling object in freefall. Now imagine that if any of those explosives, clutch, transmission, engine, decided to catastrophically fail, you were sitting in the blast radius with nowhere to go. This wasn't theoretical danger. This was routine carnage. Throughout the 1960s, drivers died. John Mulligan suffered horrific burns in a clutch explosion at the 1969 U.S. Nationals, burns that would kill him months later. Mike Sorokin lost his life the same way. Jim Nickel barely survived when his clutch exploded in the final round of the 1970 U.S. Nationals, literally sawing his car in half at over 200 miles per hour. The front section of his dragster, the section with Nicole still strapped inside, went airborne and vaulted over the guardrail. Don Prudhomme, racing alongside Nicole when it happened, thought he'd just watched his friend die right in front of him. Prudhomme later said he nearly quit the sport that day. The trauma was that profound. But despite the dangers, despite the deaths, the slingshot remained the dominant design. Why? Because it worked. The weight distribution was intuitive. Heavy engine in front, driver cantilevered behind the rear axle for traction. The steering was responsive, the cars were fast, and in drag racing, fast forgave a multitude of sins, even mortal ones. Don Garlits understood this bargain better than anyone. Born January 14, 1932 in Tampa, Florida, Garlits was something of an outsider in a sport dominated by California's aircraft industry mechanics. They called him the Floridian at first, sometimes with a sneer. But Garlits had something they didn't: an engineer's mind wrapped in a competitor's soul. He wasn't just fast, he was relentlessly innovative. His first dragster, Swamp Rat XII, appeared in 1955, a crude but effective machine powered by a Chrysler Hemi engine. The name Swamp Rat came naturally. If California's Golden Boys looked down on the guy from the Florida swamps, then he'd own it. He'd be the swamp rat they couldn't catch. Over the next 15 years, Garlits built dragster after dragster, each one numbered, each one faster. He was the first to officially break 170 miles per hour in 1957, the first to top 180 in 1958, the first to crack 200 miles per hour in 1961-1964, though controversy surrounds whether Chris Karamesines had done it first months earlier in Illinois. Regardless, Garlits was accumulating speed records like trophies, victories like breathing. But more than speed, Garlits pioneered innovation after innovation. He was the first to mount a wing on a dragster for downforce, the first to use extended wheelbase designs, the first to experiment with port fuel injection. His Swamp Rat series became legendary, each iteration a rolling laboratory for the next evolution of top fuel technology. By 1970, he'd built 13 of them. Swamp Rat XIII was his latest creation, and it represented the cutting edge of slingshot design. It featured an experimental two-speed transmission developed by Garlits himself, an innovation meant to keep the engine in its optimal power band throughout the quarter-mile. The transmission was a mechanical marvel. It was also a bomb. March 8, 1970. ATRA Grand American event at Lions Drag Strip. Garlits had already set a record earlier that day, running strong, dominating. For the final round, he rolled Swamp Rat XIII to the line against Richard Tharp in the Critz Donovan car. The crowd leaned forward. This was Big Daddy doing what Big Daddy did, winning. The Christmas tree counted down. Amber, 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 green. Garlits mashed the throttle. Approximately one-third of the way down the backstretch, traveling at over 200 miles per hour, the transmission detonated. The explosion was so violent it literally ripped the dragster in half. The front section, with the engine, the fuel, the fire, separated completely. The rear section, with Garlits strapped in, legs that had been alongside the driveline, continued down the track before spinning to a halt. In the chaos, in the smoke, in the immediate aftermath, Garlits looked down. His right foot was gone. Half of it, severed. His left foot was broken in 5 places. Shrapnel had torn through the cockpit. The car was in 2 pieces. A woman in the stands had been struck by flying debris, wounded. A young boy, injured. This wasn't just a crash. This was catastrophic failure at its most brutal. The ambulance carried Garlits to Pacific Hospital in Long Beach. For 6 weeks, he lay in a hospital bed while doctors worked to save what remained of his foot and reconstruct the damage. 6 weeks of surgeries, pain, rehabilitation. 6 weeks of visitors coming by. Racers, friends, well-wishers. Tom, the mongoose. McEwen came frequently, keeping his friends' spirits up, watching Star Trek episodes together on the hospital television. It should have been the end. Most men would have walked away, limped away, from a career that had just tried to kill them. Don Garlits was not most men. While lying in that hospital bed, while the morphine dulled the pain and the Star Trek episodes played on loop, Garlits began sketching. Not new slingshots, not improvements to the old design. He sketched something that seemed, at the time, radical, bordering on lunacy. He sketched a dragster with the engine behind the driver. Rear-engine dragsters weren't new. They'd been attempted throughout the 1960s with universally dismal results. Steve Swage's Wedge Y, Roger Lindwall's Re-Entry, Kent Fuller's Sidewinder 3. Every attempt had faced the same problems: wicked handling, snap-over steer, unpredictable steering that made the cars terrifying to drive at speed. Most rear-engine experiments ended with the car parked, the concept abandoned, the builder returning to conventional slingshot wisdom. The racing community had decided, collectively, that rear-engine dragsters simply didn't work. They were a dead end. Garlits didn't care what the community had decided. He knew the physics. He knew that if the transmission and clutch and engine were behind him, then explosions would be behind him. He'd be sitting in clear air, protected by the entire drivetrain. Safety wasn't just a bonus. It was the entire point. The question was whether he could make it work. 3 months after the accident, remarkably, Garlits was back racing. He climbed into a rebuilt Swamp Rat XIII, still a slingshot, at the AHRA Spring Nationals in Bristol, Tennessee. He set low, elapsed time and top speed. He was proving he wasn't finished. But then something happened that convinced him the slingshot era had to end. At the 1970 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis that September, Jim Nichol's clutch exploded in the final round against Don Prudhomme. The car split in two. The rear section, with Nicol inside, flew over the guardrail. Cameras from ABC's Wide World of Sports captured the entire horror. Miraculously, Nicol survived with relatively minor injuries. But Garlits, watching from the pits, made his decision. No more slingshots. Not for him, not ever again. Back in his Seffner, Florida shop, working from a wheelchair while his foot continued healing, Garlits began building Swamp Rat XIV. He enlisted help from two men who would become legendary in their own right, Tommy T.C. Lemons and Connie Swingle, mechanics with the skill and the audacity to match Garlits' vision. Together, they built something the drag racing world had never successfully seen before, a rear-engine dragster that would actually work. But actually work remained very much in question. Initial testing was a disaster. The car darted violently at speed, veering left and right unpredictably. Garlits fought the steering, overcorrecting, nearly crashing multiple times. After several terrifying test runs, the team was ready to give up. The car seemed uncontrollable, confirming every skeptic's prediction that rear-engine dragsters were doomed to fail. Then Pat Garlits stepped into the shop. Pat Garlits, Don's wife, had been with him through every victory, every crash, every innovation. She'd seen the aftermath of the March 8th accident. She'd watched doctors piece her husband back together. And now she walked into the shop and saw her husband working on a new front-engine dragster, abandoning the rear-engine project that might save his life. According to legend, Pat looked at Don and his crew and delivered an ultimatum with the force of divine command. Get back on the rear-engine car and don't stop until it works. The mechanics, intimidated by her fury, scattered to the corners of the shop. Don, chastened, listened. She wasn't asking, she was telling. So they went back to the drawing board. They studied the problem. And then Connie Swingle had an insight that would change everything. The steering ratio. Slingshot dragsters used a steering ratio of approximately 6:1. Fast, responsive, necessary for controlling a car with the weight biased heavily forward. But Swamp Rat XIV was different. The weight distribution was completely reversed. The engine, all that mass, sat behind the driver now. The front end was light. The steering was too quick, too sensitive. Every tiny input created massive corrections at speed. The solution was almost embarrassingly simple. Slow down the steering ratio from 6:1 to 10:1. They made new steering components, installed them, drove to Orlando for testing. The car tracked straight as an arrow. Suddenly, everything clicked. The rear-engine design offered massive advantages beyond safety. With the engine's weight over the rear tires, traction was phenomenal. The driver sat in front with unprecedented forward visibility. Garlits joked later that during one run, he could see a 3/8-inch bolt lying on the track. Fine thread. The 217-inch wheelbase was stable, planted, confidence-inspiring. This wasn't just a safety innovation. This was legitimately faster. In early February 1971, Garlits unveiled Swamp Rat XIV at an ATRA event at Lyons Drag Strip, the same track where Swamp Rat XIII had nearly killed him less than a year earlier. The reaction was immediate and universal. Laughter. No one wanted to make qualifying runs alongside him, fearing the car would veer into their lane. Track manager C.J. Hart, who'd witnessed other rear-engine disasters, warned Garlits that if the car crossed any barrier lines, it would be loaded onto the trailer and banned. Garlits ran 6.80 seconds right off the trailer. Straight, stable, fast. He finished second that day. Then he went to Orange County International Raceway the following weekend and finished second again. The cars were fast, but more importantly, they were working. Competitors noticed. The media noticed. Don Garlits was about to prove that the entire sport had been building dragsters wrong for 20 years. 2 weeks later, the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, California. The 1971 Winter Nats. One of drag racing's most prestigious events. Garlits qualified 10th in a 32-car field with a 6.84-second pass. Respectable, but not dominant. Then eliminations began, and something remarkable happened. Swamp Rat XIV ran low 6.70 seconds, round after round, mowing through the competition with mechanical ruthlessness. In the final, Garlits faced Rick Ramsey in the front-engine California Charger. Ramsey actually ran quicker, a 6.642 that reset the low elapsed time of the meet, but Garlits got a huge jump off the starting line and won on a hole shot. Don Garlits had just won the Winter Nationals in a rear-engine dragster, the first rear-engine car to win a major NHRA national event. The doubters were silenced. The ridicule turned to respect. But Garlits wasn't done. 5 weeks later, at the fabled March meet in Bakersfield, California, the U.S. Fuel and Gas Championships, Garlits dominated again. He ran a string of 6.60 seconds and 6.70 seconds that left the competition in the dust, defeating Gary Cochran, Dennis Baca, Don Prudhomme, Vance Hunt, and Rick Ramsey to become the first repeat March meet winner. By this point, the rear-engine revolution was official. Competitors began scrambling to build their own versions. Don Prudhomme debuted the Hot Wheels Wedge Dragster, a futuristic rear-engine design that, while aerodynamically ambitious, proved too heavy to be competitive. Others followed with varying degrees of success. The transition happened with shocking speed. By the end of 1971, multiple rear-engine cars were competing. While front-engine slingshots still won 5 of the 8 NHRA national events that year, the writing was on the wall, or rather, on the track. The rear-engine cars were faster, safer, and easier to drive once the engineering was sorted. Within 18 months, the slingshot era was effectively over. The last NHRA national event victory by a front-engine top-fuel dragster came in August 1972 at the NHRA Grand National in Montreal, Canada, when young Jim Nicol, yes, the same Nicol who'd survived the catastrophic clutch explosion in 1970, won in an old slingshot in one final, improbable upset. After that, rear-engine cars dominated completely. The impact of Swamp Rat XIV extended far beyond lap times. The design made top-fuel racing survivable. Throughout the 1970s, clutch explosions and transmission failures continued to occur, but now when they happened, the driver was sitting in front of the carnage, not within it. Lives were saved, injuries were prevented. The rear-engine configuration became standard, not because it was mandated by rules, but because it was simply better in every measurable way. Don Garlits would go on to build 34 Swamp Rat dragsters over his career, each numbered, each representing another chapter in his relentless pursuit of speed. He won 3 NHRA Top Fuel World Championships, the last at age 54. He accumulated 144 national event wins across NHRA, AHRA, and IHRA sanctioning. He was the first to break 250 miles per hour, 260, 270. In 1987, his streamlined Swamp Rat XIII was enshrined in the Smithsonian Institution as part of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., the first drag racing vehicle to receive that honor. But of all his innovations, of all his speed records, of all his victories, Swamp Rat XIV remains his most significant achievement, not because it was the fastest, not because it won the most races, but because it fundamentally redefined what a dragster could be. March 8, 1970, was supposed to be the end of Don Garlits' career. The transmission explosion that severed his foot and split Swamp Rat XIII in half should have been the final chapter in a legendary story. Most men would have taken the lesson, taken the settlement, taken the retirement. Don Garlits took the catastrophe and turned it into revolution. The rear-engine dragster wasn't just a new design. It was proof that innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from necessity. It comes from a hospital bed where a man sketches solutions to problems that nearly killed him. It comes from a wife who refuses to let her husband return to the machine that maimed him. It comes from mechanics willing to solve problems everyone else had deemed unsolvable. It comes from a racer who loved the sport too much to watch it continue killing his friends. Today, every top fuel dragster racing in NHRA competition uses a rear-engine configuration. They accelerate from 0 to over 330 miles per hour in less than 4 seconds, covering the 1,000-foot distance with nearly 12,000 horsepower. Drivers walk away from explosions, fires, and crashes that would have been fatal in the slingshot era. The sport Don Garlits helped build has become, paradoxically, one of the safest forms of motorsport despite being among the fastest. Fire and thunder. Those two elements defined the slingshot era. Fire from the nitromethane, thunder from the engines, both directed at the driver who sat in their path. Don Garlits moved the fire and thunder behind him. In doing so, he didn't just save his own life, he saved drag racing itself. That's the story of Swamp Rat XIII and the birth of the rear-engine dragster. Not just a tale of innovation, but a testament to human resilience, to the refusal to accept that something can't be done simply because it hasn't been done before. Don Garlits didn't invent the rear-engine dragster, but he perfected it. He proved it. He revolutionized an entire sport with a design born from catastrophe. And every time a modern top-fuel dragster launches down the strip, every time a driver steps out of a cockpit after an engine explosion with nothing more than singed eyebrows and a story to tell, they're living in the world Big Daddy Don Garlits created. A world where speed doesn't have to be a death sentence. A world where innovation and safety aren't opposites, but partners. A world where fire and thunder remain, but they no longer consume the men brave enough to chase them. That's the legacy of Swamp Rat XIII. Not the car that nearly killed a legend, but the car that inspired a legend to save a sport.